Hey guys, welcome to Unit 4, 1800 to 1848. You'll be halfway done after we do this unit. And this unit is the early republic. This is the period of time after the American Revolution, which really extended from 1754 all the way to 1800 with the Revolution of 1800 and the election of Thomas Jefferson. This becomes the dominance of the Democratic Republican Party. In the earlier period, Mr. Urban talked about the Jeffersonian versus Hamiltonian vision of America. This is the dominance of the Jeffersonian period of America and Jefferson's view of what America should be. And it's pretty much one-party politics through most of the time period with a couple of exceptions. All right. Story one in this unit is nationalism. All right. And this is an important concept because the conflict between nationalism and sectionalism is important throughout the U.S. history up to the Civil War, and again, starting with the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement in the 20th century. People are proud to be Americans during this time period. We won the American Revolution. The Constitution seemed like it was going to be a success. And then we begin to grow immediately with the purchase of Louisiana by Thomas Jefferson in 1803. That gave us twice as much land as we had before. Lewis and Clark explored the West, came back with all sorts of great finds, and people were excited that we were a growing young nation. A key part of nationalism is the market revolution, okay? Bringing everybody together through a singular economy. This obviously starts with the American system, Henry Clay's American system in 1816. But before this begins, we have the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 only increased nationalism in this country. It finally made us feel like we were an American nation. It kind of, for a while, got rid of the concept that you were from a state and you were from the United States. And Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans was critical to this. You can see the one picture on the far right there. That is the classic nationalism after the War of 1812. We held off the British again. We didn't really defeat them, but we were able to hold them off and show that we were a strong country. And in the wake of this, Henry Clay tried to take this up with the American system and kind of combine the country together with a sense of economic nationalism. And this is the market revolution. You've got the Lowell mills in the north. They're turning out textiles and competing against the British. We don't compete with them as well, but the fact of the matter is we are making our own textiles. This ties the northern economy to the southern economy, who is growing cotton. We also begin to tie ourselves to the west. The Erie Canal makes sure that a 3,000-mile waterway connects New York all the way down to Louisiana with the Erie Canal and the I&M Canal here in Illinois. Robert Fulton's steamboat means that the Mississippi River can now be navigated both north and south. And then finally, near the end of this time period, starting in the 1830s, you get the beginnings of the building of railroads, which will eventually lie alongside canals, but then eventually replace canals. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad is the first of many railroads that would be built in the eastern part of the country, east of the Mississippi River during this time period. And most importantly, we are dealing with foreign countries in a way that basically we don't want to deal with foreign countries. And that is the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, this is kind of a play off of Washington's neutrality policy. We don't really want to get integrated with Europe. We don't want the Europeans over here in the Western Hemisphere because we know that we would get pulled into European affairs. And so we kind of issue a bluff and say that we don't want to be involved. We don't want Europeans to be involved in the Western Hemisphere, and that the Western Hemisphere is a democratic American hemisphere. And this also helps to lead to democratic revolutions for a time period in Central and South America. All right. So trying to pull the country together and bringing it into a unified United States. As opposed to that is story number two, which is also the increasing sectionalism that is creeping in as we're trying to bring the country together. And this has to, again, do with economics and to some level politics. The South and the North just do not have the same economy. Now, even though they can coexist, the South producing raw materials, the North producing the finished products, Northern banks financing Southern cotton plantations, Northern banks financing the purchase of slaves. The fact of the matter is, in the North, you have free wage labor, especially by new immigrants, which we'll talk about in a minute. And in the South, you have a slave plantation labor system where a small percentage of Southerners hold most of the wealth, not only in the South, but in the entire nation. And they hold massive plantations with 200 plus slaves. This was the exception, not the rule. Remember that only 25% of Southerners owned only one slave, and less than 1% owned over 200 slaves. 75% of all Southerners never owned a slave. A lot of this obviously has to do with the cotton gin. The cotton gin invented to end slavery, instead perpetuated slavery. This is a shift from tobacco to cotton. King cotton. Cotton will be the main money maker for not only the South, but the entire United States. It makes the United States very wealthy. And you already start to see the fractures in the country with the Missouri Compromise. This is a very important concept, guys, in 1820. It basically dooms the concept that there are slave states and free states, and every political conflict between 1820 and 1860 is going to revolve around whether or not new territories come into the Union as a slave state or a free state. You start to see the political battles on this right away with the nullification crisis, when the South Carolina specifically, wants to argue against the Northern tariffs. Besides slavery, one of the issues that came in during this time were tariffs. The South saw tariffs as punitive. The North saw tariffs as protecting their fledgling industry against larger European industry. Now, Jackson was a strong enough president to put down the nullification crisis, but it's these kind of political battles that are going to eventually lead to the 1850s and the lack of compromise, which is eventually going to lead to the Civil War. So, when we go forward, these are good context for those kinds of concepts. Also, Jackson got rid of the National Bank. Remember, the Jeffersonians had never really been in favor of banks, and he gets rid of the bank at this time period. And not until Polk sets up a federal treasury are you going to have a unified monetary system. This also leads to the first major economic panic, the Panic of 1837. There is one in 1819, but the one in 1837 was much worse. So we do have immigration at this time. How does that lead to sectionalism? A lot of immigrants move to northern cities. The Germans actually move to the west and become farmers, and they become the wage laborers that the South plays off against the slaves. It also splits the country because a lot of people start to dislike the number of immigrants coming into the country, and this is called nativism. This will eventually lead to the Know Nothing Party in the 1850s, and a term you really need to know, nativists, because that's a term obviously we see through each wave of immigration. And then the final story is the increased political participation by more members of society, and then the first major period of reform. Remember, you only have reform in the United States when a country is at peace and has prosperity. And this is a huge time period from 1800 to 1848, with the exception of the War of 1812. We have no real enemies during this time period. We are growing. We are expanding. The country, because of the market revolution, is doing economically very well. And when things are going well, people try to look for things that are wrong and try to fix them. And that is what becomes the Second Great Awakening. Now, before we get to the Second Great Awakening, you have to understand the position of Jackson, because they do tie together here. All right. Jackson is the beneficiary of what is becoming increased political participation. Universal white male suffrage. All men by 1828, when Jackson finally gets elected, are given the right to vote. The property qualification is eliminated. Women are also advocating for the right to vote this time, but obviously will not get this for another 100 years. But this also creates a second party. So because of Jackson, you get what I like to call the party of Jackson haters, or the Whigs. The Whigs are made up of a coalition of people who don't always necessarily agree with each other. Calhoun, Webster, Clay Clay's the main figure that you want to think about when you think about the Whig Party. But the one thing they have in common is they dislike Jackson. Jackson created the modern Democratic Party. And because of that, you now have a functioning two-party system. This is still the dominance of Jeffersonian America, and it will go on again until about 1848 or 1840 when the first Whig president gets elected. But the key here is that you now have a functioning two-party system. Within this concept, within this explosion of political participation and voting comes the reform, and that is the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening, in most cases, is led by women. Many of the reforms had to do with just, in their eyes, of improving society. There was a large religious element to the Second Great Awakening. The burnt out district in New York. There was an explosion of Protestant churches throughout the North and the South. There was the creation of new religions during this time period. But they focused on things like temperance, no alcohol, helping people who were put into prison to reform them, people who were put into mental institutions. But the number one thing that you should always think about when you think about the Second Great Awakening is slavery. It ultimately becomes all about abolitionism. Most people said you can't fix the problems in society until you get rid of the system in which we're enslaving African Americans. This leads to William Lloyd Garrison, the one man who could make a difference. He single-handedly, starting in 1831, makes abolitionism incredibly popular by the 1840s in the North, and the abolition movement is eventually going to make the Southerners unhappy, and that combination is going to lead to the 1850s. You also, on the same year that William Lloyd Garrison comes, has Nat Turner's Rebellion. The response of Southerners to slave violence is to make slavery even stricter and to make even more strict slave laws and basically double down on holding slaves. And this is only going to increase the wedge between the North and the South, going back to the story of sectionalism. And then finally, obviously, you've got the story of women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the most important women in American history, the Seneca Falls Convention, the Declaration of the Rights and Sentiments, and fighting against this concept of the cult of domesticity, which women in this country will fight against up through the 1950s, and which basically separates women into the household and men into the workspace. All right. So these are the three major stories during this time period. This is an incredibly important time period. They like to ask a lot of questions on this time period. This time period provides great context for the next time period, for the 1850s and the Civil War. Context for this period would be the ultimate rise of the Jeffersonian Party and the nationalism that came out of creating a new country and a new constitution in the previous time period. So look for those connections between the time periods, and those will provide you with context. All right, hope this helps, guys. Thanks a lot.